The autumn storm descended upon Thornwood Hall with the fury of something long suppressed, rain lashing against ancient windows, while thunder rolled across the moorlands like the voice of an angry god, and within the great house's western tower, Sebastian Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, stood motionless before the glass, his tall figure silhouetted against each flash of lightning that illuminated the vast, lonely estate, stretching into darkness below. The oaks in the distant grove bent and writhed like supplicants before an unforgiving master, their branches clawing at the sky, and Sebastian watched them with eyes that had grown accustomed to such violence, nature's and otherwise, his reflection, a ghost in the rain-streaked pane, features carved from shadow and old grief. He was 32 years old and felt ancient, worn hollow by whispers that followed him through every ballroom he no longer entered, every society gathering that fell silent at the mere mention of his name. The Duke who drove his wife to madness, they said, the Duke whose servants trembled at his footsteps, the Duke whom decent families warned their daughters about in hushed, thrilling tones. Asterisk, let them whisper asterisk, he thought, pressing one palm flat against the cold glass as lightning split the sky once more. Asterisk, let them craft their monsters from my silence. I have grown too weary to correct them. Asterisk, the truth was a weight he had stopped trying to lift years ago, when he realized that innocence meant nothing against the poison of well-placed rumors, that a man's character could be dismantled by a single enemy with enough spite and social currency to wield. His first wife, Catherine, had been ill long before their marriage. Consumption of the mind. The physicians had called it a slow fading that no devotion could halt, and he had held her hand through every dark night until the end, had loved her with the desperate tenderness of a man trying to anchor someone slipping away, but that story held no currency in drawing rooms hungry for scandal. Thornwood Hall itself seemed to breathe with the storm, its ancient timbers groaning, its corridors empty of all but the most steadfast servants, who had learned that their master's brooding was not cruelty but sorrow turned inward, calcified into something resembling coldness only to those who never looked closely. Sebastian turned from the window at last, crossing to the fireplace where flames cast dancing shadows across portraits of Blackwood ancestors, men and women who had built this dynasty through war and will, and he wondered if any of them had felt this same hollowness, this victory without triumph, this inheritance of power that purchased nothing he truly wanted. The clock on the mantel struck 11, and as if summoned by the hour itself, a sharp knock interrupted his contemplation. His butler, Edwards, entered with an expression Sebastian had learned to read over 20 years of service, something between concern and the careful neutrality of a man bearing unwelcome news. "Your Grace," Edward said, extending a silver tray upon which rested a single letter, its crimson seal gleaming wetly in the firelight. This arrived by urgent courier despite the storm. The rider insisted it could not wait until morning. Sebastian's gaze fell upon the seal, and something cold moved through his chest. A serpent coiled around a sword, the crest of Lord Cornelius Vane, the man who had methodically destroyed everything Sebastian once held dear. He took the letter with steady hands that belied the sudden racing of his heart, and as thunder shook the windows once more, he broke the seal. The paper felt brittle between Sebastian's fingers, as though the malice contained within its words had leached into the very fibers, and as his eyes moved across the elegant script, penmanship, he recognized with a visceral hatred that time had done nothing to diminish. The room seemed to contract around him, the storm outside fading to a distant roar beneath the thunder of his own pulse. Asterisk Lord Cornelius. Vane requests the pleasure of announcing his forthcoming marriage to Lady Eleanor Ashford. Asterisk. The letter began with poisoned courtesy, asterisk, and wishes to extend his most gracious invitation to the Duke of Ashworth, that old wounds might be healed, and bygones buried beneath the joy of this union times. And Sebastian read the words 3 times before his mind would accept their meaning, before the name that had haunted his dreams for 5 long years could settle into the reality of what Vane intended. Eleanor, asterisk, his times. Eleanor, though she had never truly been his, had she, except for one golden summer when the world had seemed limitless and hope had not yet become a luxury he could not afford. He remembered her as she had been then, 20 years old, with autumn hair that caught fire in sunlight and eyes the color of spring storms, quick with laughter and quicker still with wit that had sliced through his carefully constructed armor as though it were paper. They had met at a country house party, thrown together by chance seating arrangements and mutual boredom with the endless parade of social performances, and within a week Sebastian had known with terrifying certainty that he would never want another woman as long as he drew breath. They had walked through moonlit gardens, speaking of philosophy and poetry, had argued about politics with a passion that left them both breathless and hungry for more, had stolen one single kiss beneath a willow tree, her lips soft and wondering against his, her fingers trembling where they gripped his lapels before Cornelius Vane, who had wanted Eleanor for himself and hated Sebastian for reasons rooted in old family grievances and newer jealousies, had begun his campaign of destruction. The rumors started small, as such things always do. Whispers about Sebastian's temperament, suggestions that his intensity bordered on instability, carefully planted seeds that grew into a poisonous garden of lies. By autumn, polite society had concluded that the Duke of Ashworth was dangerous, unpredictable, unsuitable, and Eleanor's father had forbidden her from any further contact, had removed her from society entirely until the scandal passed, and Sebastian had watched his future collapse into ash without ever being granted the chance to defend himself. He had written to her, of course, letters that went unanswered, intercepted, he suspected now, by the same machinations that had orchestrated his downfall, and eventually his pride had curdled into something resembling acceptance, had convinced him that perhaps she had believed the lies, that perhaps he had been a fool to imagine someone so bright could love something so shadowed. But now this letter revealed the final cruelty of Vane's design, the Ashford family's financial ruin, which Sebastian had heard whispered about in recent months, was no accident of fate, but rather the closing of a trap 5 years in the making. Vane had destroyed Sebastian to claim Eleanor, and when she had remained unmarried faithful, Sebastian realized with a sharp ache, to a memory of something that might have been, Vane had simply found another lever to force her hand. The letter crumpled in Sebastian's fist, and when he looked up, Edwards had already retreated, leaving him alone with the storm and the impossible truth that the woman he loved was walking willingly into the spider's web to save her family from a ruin that Vane himself had engineered. Ashford Manor had once been beautiful, Eleanor remembered, standing in the bedchamber that had been hers since childhood, her fingers tracing the faded damask wallpaper where roses had bloomed in crimson and gold before years of neglect had stolen their vibrancy, leaving only ghosts of pattern beneath her touch. Much like the years had stolen her own bloom, she thought with bitter clarity, transforming the spirited girl who had once danced through these halls into this hollow creature who moved through rooms like someone already departed, already grieving a life that would never be lived. The trunk before her yawned open, waiting to swallow the meager remnants of her existence. 3 serviceable dresses mended so many times the original fabric had become a memory, a handful of books she could not bear to sell, her mother's pearl earrings saved from creditors through desperate pleading, and buried at the bottom where no one would see, a single dried rose from a garden she tried never to remember, pressed between the pages of a volume of sonnets that a man with storm-dark eyes had once quoted to her beneath a willow tree's sheltering branches. Asterisk, Sebastian, asterisk. She did not allow herself to think his name. Often it had become a discipline over the 5 years since their summer, a careful excision of hope that she performed daily like a surgeon, removing diseased tissue to save the patient. But today, with her fate sealed in contracts and arrangements, and her body soon to belong to the very man who had destroyed him, his name rose unbidden and would not be silenced. She remembered everything, the way he had listened to her as though her thoughts mattered, the intensity in his gaze that had made her feel seen for the first time in her life, the trembling restraint in his hands when they had finally touched, and most painfully, the single kiss that had promised a future neither of them would ever claim. When the rumors began, whispers of his instability, his dangerous temperament, the suggestion that any woman who bound herself to him would suffer for it, she had not believed them, had fought against her father's decree with every weapon available to a powerless young woman, which was to say, no weapons at all. They had taken her from society, hidden her away until the scandal cooled, and by the time she emerged, Sebastian had retreated into his northern fortress, and the world had moved on, indifferent to the wreckage left in its wake. Now her mother lay in the next room, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Eleanor washed in secret, so the remaining servants would not know how advanced the consumption had become. Her younger sister Charlotte, barely 18, and still possessing the hope Eleanor had long since abandoned, needed a dowry, needed prospects, needed a future that only money could purchase, and Lord Cornelius Vane had appeared like an answer to prayers Eleanor had stopped believing would be heard, offering salvation at the price of everything she was. She knew what Vane was, had always known, even before Sebastian's ruin, had sensed the coldness beneath his charm, like winter lurking beneath autumn's last warm days. But what choice remained when the alternative was watching her mother die in a debtor's prison, watching Charlotte's light extinguish under the weight of poverty and shame? Eleanor closed the trunk with hands that did not tremble, because she had trained them not to, and pressed her palm flat against the worn leather, as though sealing a coffin. The girl who had loved Sebastian Blackwood was dead. The woman who would marry Cornelius Vane was something else entirely, something harder, something hollowed out and filled with duty instead of dreams, and if her heart still beat within her chest, it beat only out of habit, a mechanical persistence that she suspected would trouble her less with each passing year. The carriage wheels ground through mud that seemed to grasp at them with desperate fingers, as though the very earth conspired to slow Eleanor's progress toward the fate that awaited her, and she pressed her forehead against the rain-streaked window, watching the countryside transform from the familiar poverty of her family's withered lands into something else entirely, something prosperous and manicured and deeply, inexplicably wrong. The rain had not ceased since they departed Ashford Manor 3 days prior, falling in sheets that obscured the horizon and turned the world into a watercolor of greys and muted greens, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the obscuring weather, for the way it wrapped the carriage in a cocoon of isolation that required no conversation, no performance of the contentment she did not feel. Martha sat across from her, the elderly maid's worn hands busy with needlework that Eleanor suspected existed primarily to give them both something to look at besides each other's eyes, where too much truth might be read. And when their gazes did meet, Martha offered only a small, sad smile that communicated everything words could not. *I am sorry, my lady. I am here. I wish I could save you from this. *. They stopped at an inn on the second night, a prosperous establishment at the edge of Vane's territory, where the innkeeper's wife took one look at Eleanor's travelling clothes and the crest on the carriage door and curtsied so deeply her knees cracked, murmuring congratulations on her ladyship's fortunate engagement to his lordship. But Eleanor noticed the way the woman's eyes flickered, noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth, and later, when she descended for a cup of tea she did not want but needed as excuse to escape her suffocating room, she overheard the servants speaking in low voices near the kitchen. Another lamb for the slaughter, one said, and another hushed her sharply, but not before Eleanor heard. The last one, his cousin's girl. She ran off rather than times, and then silence fell as they noticed her standing in the doorway, and their faces arranged themselves into masks of servile pleasantness that fooled no one. Eleanor returned to her room and did not sleep, lying awake as the rain hammered against the windows, like a warning she could not heed, and when dawn broke, grey and weeping, she climbed back into the carriage with the taste of ash in her mouth and the servants' whispers echoing in her mind. The Vane lands stretched before her now, rolling hills dotted with fat sheep and golden haystacks despite the season, orchards heavy with fruit, tenant cottages that appeared well-maintained and prosperous, a kingdom of plenty built. She now understood, on the deliberate destruction of families like her own, on debts called in at strategic moments, on reputations ruined and hopes crushed beneath the wheels of one man's ambition. A gilded cage, she thought, as the spires of Blackmore Hall finally emerged from the mist, with a spider at its center, and I am wrapping myself in silk for him. She straightened her spine, checked that her expression revealed nothing of the terror blooming in her chest, and prepared to meet her future with the only weapons remaining to her, endurance and the small, stubborn flame of selfhood that she refused to let him extinguish, no matter what the marriage cost her. Blackmore Hall rose before her like a monument to everything cold and calculated in the world, its grey stone facade stretching toward the weeping sky, with Gothic arches that seemed designed to diminish all who approached, and Eleanor descended from the carriage on legs that threatened to betray her, forcing steadiness into limbs that wanted to flee as the great doors swung open and revealed. The man who would own her, Lord Cornelius Vane, stood in the entrance hall like a spider welcoming a fly, his smile precise and practiced, his pale eyes moving over her with an assessment so thorough she felt stripped bare despite her travelling clothes. Catalogued and valued and found, she suspected, from the slight curve of his thin lips, adequate to his purposes. "Lady Eleanor," he said, and his voice was silk over steel, pleasant enough to the ear, while carrying undertones that made something primitive in her chest recoil. "How delighted I am to welcome you to your new home. You must be exhausted from your journey, but I confess I could not wait another moment to see my bride," and he took her hand with fingers that were cold despite the fires blazing in every hearth, lifting it to lips that pressed against her skin with proprietary certainty, and Eleanor heard herself responding with the correct pleasantries, felt her mouth forming words of gratitude and anticipation that tasted like poison, while behind her eyes she retreated to that small, fortified place where the truth of her feelings could remain hidden. He was handsome, she supposed, in the way that a marble statue is handsome, all clean lines and classical proportions, golden hair swept back from a high forehead, features that society's matrons would call distinguished. But there was something missing behind his eyes, some essential warmth that should animate human expression, and when he smiled at her, she saw only the calculation of a man examining an investment. Over tea in a drawing-room so opulent it bordered on grotesque, Vane outlined his vision for their union with the brisk efficiency of a man discussing a business merger. Her family's social connections, diminished but not destroyed, would complement his wealth. Her youth and health promised the heirs he required. Her gratitude for rescue from penury would ensure her compliance and loyalty. He did not say this last part aloud, but Eleanor heard it nonetheless, hovering beneath every word like a threat wrapped in courtesy. "We shall announce the engagement at a ball next week," he informed her, not asking her preference. "And marry before Christmas. I see no reason for delay, do you?" And when a young footman stumbled slightly while refilling Vane's cup, sloshing a single drop onto the pristine tablecloth, Vane's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The pleasant mask dropped away to reveal something vicious beneath, his voice cracking like a whip as he berated the boy with words designed to wound, threatening dismissal without reference, destruction of the young man's prospects, all for a single drop of spilled tea. And Eleanor sat frozen, watching the footman tremble and apologize, understanding with horrible clarity exactly what manner of man she had sold herself to, what cruelties awaited behind closed doors when the audience departed and the performance ended. That night, alone in chambers more luxurious than any she had occupied in years, Eleanor pressed her face into silk pillows that smelled of lavender and wealth, and wept until no tears remained, wept for the girl she had been, for the future she would never have, for Sebastian whom she had wrongly blamed, and for herself, trapped in a web of obligation and fear from which she could see no escape. The night of the engagement ball arrived, with all the terrible grandeur of an execution dressed in silk and candlelight, and Eleanor descended the great staircase of Blackmore Hall, wearing a gown of ice-blue satin that Vane had selected for her, had insisted upon, in fact, with that cold smile that permitted no argument, and she felt the fabric against her skin, like armor, like a shroud, like the beautiful wrapping on a gift no one had asked for, while below her the cream of society gathered in glittering clusters, their jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles as they whispered behind fans and gloved hands about the Ashford girl's extraordinary fortune, her family's disgrace, her luck in catching a man of Vane's wealth, and standing despite having nothing to offer but a pretty face and a desperate need. Vane met her at the bottom of the stairs with proprietary satisfaction gleaming in his pale eyes, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm with fingers that pressed just slightly too hard against her wrist, a silent reminder of ownership. And he paraded her through the assembled guests like a general displaying conquered territory, accepting congratulations with gracious nods, while Eleanor smiled until her face ached, murmured appropriate gratitudes, and felt herself disappearing piece by piece into the role she had agreed to play. The orchestra swelled with a waltz, and Vane led her onto the floor where they turned and turned beneath the painted ceiling, and Eleanor fixed her gaze on a point beyond his shoulder and let her body move through the familiar steps, while her mind retreated to that fortified place where nothing could touch her. But then a ripple passed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that made even Vane's smooth steps falter, and Eleanor turned her head toward the source of the disturbance, and the world simply stopped, ceased its relentless spinning, because there in the doorway stood Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth. The man society whispered had driven his wife to madness, the man she had loved and lost and blamed for 5 long years, and he was looking directly at her, with eyes that burned like storm clouds lit from within. And Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something she had thought safely buried, beneath layers of duty and resignation and carefully cultivated numbness. He was changed, she saw in that frozen moment, harder and darker than the young man who had held her hand in a moonlit garden 5 summers past, his black evening clothes severe against the peacock colors surrounding him, his face carved into lines that spoke of suffering endured in solitude, but his eyes, God, his eyes were exactly as she remembered, intense and searching and seeing her, truly times seeing times her, in a way no one had in years. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship as he crossed the ballroom floor, and Eleanor watched him approach with her heart hammering against her ribs, watched Vane's jaw tighten and his fingers dig bruisingly into her waist, watched Sebastian stop before them and execute a bow that was technically perfect and somehow utterly insolent, and when he straightened and their eyes met fully for the first time, she understood with terrible clarity that whatever peace she had made with her fate had just been shattered beyond all hope of repair. The library of Blackmore Hall smelled of old leather and older secrets, and Sebastian found Vane there exactly as he had anticipated, the snake retreating to his den to savor his triumph, a glass of brandy in hand, and a smile of cruel satisfaction curving his thin lips, as Sebastian closed the door behind him with a decisive click that echoed like the cocking of a pistol. "Ashworth," Vane said, not bothering to rise, swirling his drink with deliberate insolence, "I wondered how long it would take you to seek me out, come to offer your congratulations in private, have you? How touching that even the beast of Thornwood observes the social niceties." Sebastian remained by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, because he did not trust himself not to wrap them around Vane's throat if they were free, and when he spoke his voice was low and controlled, with the kind of control that costs a man everything he has. "What is your game with Eleanor Ashford?" he demanded, and Vane's smile widened into something genuinely amused, as though Sebastian had just performed a particularly entertaining trick. "My times game asterisk?" Vane repeated, savouring the word. "There is no game, your grace merely a business arrangement that benefits all parties involved. Lady Eleanor gains security for her family, and I gain, well," his pale eyes glittered with malice, "I gain a beautiful, well-bred wife who will be appropriately grateful times for her rescue. Surely even you can appreciate the elegance of such an arrangement." The memories surged through Sebastian like a fever. Eleanor's face 5 years ago when she had turned away from him, believing the lies Vane had so carefully seeded through society, the whispers that followed him like shadows, painting him as a man capable of unspeakable cruelties, the slow death of every hope he had ever allowed himself to hold. "You destroyed her family deliberately," Sebastian said, and the truth of it crystallized as he spoke, pieces falling into place with horrible precision. "You engineered their ruin to force this marriage. You have been planning this for years." Vane's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at Sebastian's perception, but he recovered quickly, setting down his glass and rising to face his enemy with the confidence of a man who holds all the cards. "And what if I have? She is times mine times now. Ashworth legally, socially, irrevocably times mine asterisk. Whatever pathetic tenderness you harbored for her, whatever delusions you entertained during that absurd summer courtship, they are finished. She chose survival. She chose times me asterisk." Sebastian moved then, crossing the space between them with predatory swiftness that made Vane stumble backward against his desk, and Sebastian's hand closed around Vane's cravat, twisting the silk until the other man's face began to purple, and his voice emerged as something barely human, a growl torn from the darkest depths of his chest. Asterisk, touch her and die. Asterisk. Vane's laugh was strangled but genuine, and when Sebastian released him in disgust, he straightened his cravat with trembling fingers and eyes that promised retribution. "The monster reveals himself at last," he rasped. "Interfere with my engagement, Ashworth, and I will destroy what little remains of your reputation. I will tell the world every detail of what you did to your poor wife. And this time, asterisk, no one times will doubt me." Sebastian turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle, and when he looked back his expression had settled into something cold and resolute, a man who has finally found a purpose worth any price. "Then let the world talk," he said quietly. "I have been their monster for 5 years. Perhaps it is time I gave them reason to fear me." He left Vane, clutching his throat in the candlelit library, and as he strode through Blackmore's halls toward the knight and his waiting carriage, Sebastian made himself a vow as binding as any spoken before God. He would free Eleanor from this gilded trap, or he would burn Vane's entire world to ashes in the attempt. The discovery came 3 days after the ball, when Eleanor's restless wandering through Blackmore Hall's labyrinthine corridors led her to a door she had not noticed before, half hidden behind a heavy tapestry depicting some ancient hunting scene. The brass handle tarnished with disuse, and something about its forgotten quality called to her, whispered of secrets kept in darkness, and she found herself turning that handle before caution could counsel otherwise. The room beyond was a private study, smaller than Vane's official library but infinitely more revealing, the air thick with dust motes that danced in the pale light filtering through grimy windows, and Eleanor moved through the space like a ghost herself, trailing her fingers across ledgers and loose papers stacked upon a mahogany desk that bore the scars of years of urgent correspondence. She told herself she was merely curious, merely exploring the prison that would become her home, but her hands knew better as they opened drawers and rifled through documents with increasing desperation, searching for something she could not name until she found it, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, hidden beneath a false bottom that yielded to her probing fingers as though it had been waiting for her all along. The first letter made her breath catch. The second made her sink into Vane's chair with trembling legs. The third made her press her hand against her mouth to stifle a cry that would have brought servants running. Here was the proof laid bare in Vane's own meticulous handwriting. Correspondence with a London solicitor detailing the systematic destruction of Ashford finances through manipulated investments and called-in debts. Letters to society hostesses planting the seeds of rumour about Sebastian Blackwood's treatment of his ailing wife. A cold-blooded accounting of Eleanor's worth as a bride, not for her beauty or breeding but for the Ashford lands that bordered Vane's estate, lands he had coveted for decades and would finally possess through marriage. Asterisk. He planned this asterisk, Eleanor realized, the truth settling into her bones like ice water. Asterisk. He planned all of it. Father's investments failing, mother's increasing illness from the stress of poverty, Sebastian's disgrace that drove him from my side, all of it orchestrated, like moves on a chessboard, by a player who saw people as nothing more than pieces to be sacrificed. Asterisk. She thought of Sebastian's face in the ballroom, the barely leashed fury when he had confronted Vane, and she understood now what he must have suffered. These 5 years, not the guilt of a man who had wronged his wife, but the helpless rage of one falsely accused, watching the woman he loved believe the lies of his enemy. The papers shook in her hands as she carefully replaced them, her mind racing through impossible calculations. She could not simply flee, not with her mother's life hanging in the balance of Vane's promised financial support, not with her sister's future still held hostage, but neither could she marry this monster now that she knew the full scope of his villainy. She needed help, needed an ally, needed times, Sebastian asterisk, and as she slipped from the hidden study and replaced the tapestry with shaking fingers, Eleanor began to form the first desperate outlines of a plan that would require her to become something she had never been before. Not a victim, not a sacrifice, but a player in her own right, ready at last to fight for the life that had been stolen from her. The rose garden at Blackmore Hall had been abandoned for years, its once manicured paths now overgrown with wild brambles and its arbors collapsing under the weight of unpruned vines, and it was here, in this forgotten corner where beauty had been left to decay, that Eleanor waited in the silver light of a cloud-veiled moon, her dark cloak pulled tight against the autumn chill, and her heart hammering so violently she feared its sound would carry across the silent grounds and betray her to the watchful house behind her. She had received Sebastian's message through Martha, who had encountered his coachman at the village market, a few whispered words, a time, a place, and though every rational thought warned her of the danger, her feet had carried her here as though moved by a force older and more powerful than reason, and when she heard the soft crunch of gravel beneath boots and turned to see Sebastian emerging from the shadows between 2 decrepit topiaries, she felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed shut for 5 long years. "You came," he breathed, and his voice held such wonder, such desperate relief, that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes even as she held herself rigid against the impulse to run to him. "Did you think I would not?" she asked. And there was more accusation in her tone than she intended. Years of hurt and confusion, and bitter nights spent wondering why he had abandoned her without explanation, bleeding through despite her efforts at composure. "After the ballroom, after what you said to vain Sebastian, what is happening? What game are you playing?" He moved closer, near enough that she could see the sharp planes of his face in the moonlight, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. And when he spoke, his voice was raw with an honesty that stripped away all pretense. "No game, Eleanor, never a game. Not with you. Everything you believed about me, everything Vane told you 5 years ago, the rumors about Catherine, about my cruelty, it was all lies, carefully constructed lies designed to drive you from me and destroy any chance we might have had." Eleanor's breath caught as she reached into her cloak and withdrew the letters she had copied in trembling haste from Vane's hidden study, pressing them into Sebastian's hands with urgent desperation. "I know," she whispered. "I found proof he orchestrated everything, your ruin and mine, my family's destruction, all of it planned for years because he wanted our lands, wanted times me times as some kind of trophy in his victory over you." Sebastian's hands closed over the papers, but his eyes never left her face, and in them she saw something fierce and tender and terrifying in its intensity. "I never stopped loving you," he said, the words falling between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that could never be undone. "I withdrew because I thought my ruined name would only bring you further pain. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." Eleanor's composure finally shattered, and she gripped his lapels with desperate fingers, her voice breaking. "And I cannot simply flee my mother, my sister. They will be destroyed if I break this engagement without—" The snap of a twig somewhere beyond the garden wall silenced them both, and Sebastian's arm came around her waist, pulling her into the deeper shadows of a crumbling archway, their bodies pressed together, hearts racing in unified terror as footsteps passed nearby and slowly faded. "I will find a way," Sebastian breathed against her hair, his hand trembling where it rested against her back. "I swear to you, Eleanor, I will find a way to free you from him without destroying your family. Trust me just a little longer, can you trust me?" She looked up into his shadowed face, and her hand rose of its own accord to touch his cheek, feeling the muscle clench beneath her fingertips. "I trust you," she whispered, and in those 3 words lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The change in Vane's demeanor began subtly, a sharpening of his gaze when Eleanor entered a room, a new habit of appearing in doorways where she had not expected him, and within days of her secret meeting with Sebastian, Eleanor understood with growing dread that her carefully constructed mask of compliance had slipped, revealing something beneath that had awakened her captor's suspicion and transformed Blackmore Hall from a gilded cage into a hunting ground where she was perpetually the prey. "You seem distracted, my dear," Vane observed at breakfast one morning, his knife sliding through a blood-rare cut of beef with surgical precision. Distant, one might even say, hopeful. "I do wonder what could have inspired such a transformation in a woman who, mere weeks ago, seemed resigned to her fate." Eleanor forced her hand steady as she lifted her teacup, forced her voice into the hollow pleasantness she had perfected through weeks of practice. "I am merely becoming accustomed to my new circumstances, my lord. Surely that pleases you." His smile did not reach his eyes. "What pleases me is obedience, Lady Eleanor, loyalty, the certain knowledge that my investments are secure." He let the word hang between them, times investments, times a reminder that she was property, purchased through her family's desperation, and Eleanor felt the walls of her prison contract another inch. The following days brought new constraints. A footman now accompanied her on every walk. Her correspondence was collected by Vane's butler before posting, and Martha reported with frightened eyes that she had been questioned about her mistress's activities, her visitors, her midnight wanderings. Eleanor adapted, channeling her desperation into the delicate art of concealment. And it was Martha who suggested the solution embroidery samplers, innocuous domestic handicrafts sent to Lady Sophia Blackwood, Sebastian's younger sister and a convenient mutual acquaintance from Eleanor's debutante years, with messages hidden in the pattern of stitches that only someone who knew to look would ever decipher. Through this fragile thread of silk and subterfuge, Eleanor and Sebastian maintained their connection. Warnings of Vane's movements, reassurances of continued planning, the simple sustaining knowledge that she was not alone in her imprisonment. But Vane's paranoia deepened with each passing day, and Eleanor witnessed the violence that lurked beneath his civilized veneer when, during a ride across his estate, his horse stumbled on uneven ground, and he responded by striking the animal across the face with his riding crop, again and again, until blood streamed from its velvet muzzle, and Eleanor had to look away, bile rising in her throat and her whole body trembling with the understanding that this was the fate awaiting any creature who displeased him. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks," Vane announced that evening, his tone brooking no argument. "I see no reason for extended delay, and every reason for security." Eleanor bowed her head in apparent submission, but beneath her lowered lashes, behind the placid mask she wore like armor, her mind raced through calculations of time and distance and desperate hope, counting the days until Sebastian could save her or until Vane's patience shattered entirely and the violence she had witnessed, visited upon a horse, found its true intended target. The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied a narrow building in the legal district of London, its windows perpetually grimy with coal smoke and its corridors thick with the musty scent of old paper and older secrets, and it was here that Sebastian Blackwood had established his base of operations in the desperate campaign to destroy Lord Cornelius Vane before Vane could claim Eleanor forever. "The financial records are damning, Your Grace, Mr. Whitmore said, spreading documents across his cluttered desk with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. "Lord Vane has engaged in systematic manipulation of market prices, destruction of competing businesses through fraudulent means, and most significantly, he appears to have orchestrated the collapse of no fewer than 3 families' fortunes, including the Ashfords, through calculated investment schemes designed to fail." Sebastian studied the papers with burning intensity, each revelation another stone in the edifice of evidence he was constructing, but it was the final document that stopped his breath. A coroner's report from 4 years past, detailing the death of one Mr. Harold Pemberton, Vane's former business partner, ruled an accident but surrounded by whispered suspicions that had never been properly investigated. "There were witnesses," Whitmore continued, his voice dropping, "a footman who was dismissed shortly after, a maid who left service and relocated to the country people who saw things that contradicted the official account. If we could locate them, persuade them to speak." Sebastian's jaw tightened as he absorbed the full scope of Vane's corruption, the casual destruction of lives that meant nothing to a man who viewed the world as pieces on a chessboard, and he understood with crystalline clarity that Eleanor was not merely a trophy or a prize. She was a move in a game that had been playing since before she was born. A final humiliation aimed at Sebastian himself, revenge for some ancient slight he could barely remember. The investigation led Sebastian to darker places still. Taverns where Vane's dismissed servants drowned their fears in gin, country cottages where frightened witnesses had hidden from the long reach of their former master's influence, and finally, inevitably, to the truth about his own past, the lies that had transformed him from a respected duke into a monster in the eyes of society. Catherine was ill, Sebastian told Whitmore, speaking aloud the truth he had guarded in silence for years, a wasting sickness of the mind that no physician could name or cure. "I did not drive her to madness. I held her hand through its slow progression, hired nurses, consulted specialists across Europe, sat with her through the screaming nights and the silent days until the end finally came, as a mercy." He produced letters, medical records, testimony from the very doctors Vane had later paid to remain silent, and as the evidence accumulated, Sebastian felt the weight of 5 years' false shame begin, slowly, to lift from his shoulders. But time was the enemy now. Eleanor's latest message, decoded from the careful stitches of a sampler depicting autumn roses, had warned of an accelerated wedding, mere weeks away, and Sebastian knew that evidence alone would not be enough. He needed a strategy bold enough to cut through Vane's defenses, public enough to force society's hand, and he needed it before the woman he loved was bound forever to the architect of both their destructions. The summons came on a grey morning when even the light seemed to have abandoned hope, and Eleanor found Lord Vane waiting for her in his study, standing before the fireplace with a document in his hand and a smile on his face that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. "I have received word from my solicitors," he said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant, as though discussing the weather or the quality of the morning's tea, "and I find myself in possession of some rather distressing news regarding your family's financial situation, news that I fear requires immediate action on both our parts." Eleanor's hands clenched in the folds of her dress, her nails biting into her palms as she forced herself to meet his gaze with the hollow composure she had perfected through weeks of captivity. "I was not aware there were new developments, my lord." Vane's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "Your family's debts have been called in, my dear, all of them, by various creditors who have grown impatient with the extended terms I so generously arranged. Your mother faces debtor's prison within the month. Your sister will be turned out onto the streets without a penny or a prospect. The Ashford name will be erased from respectable society forever." He paused, letting the words sink into her flesh like poison. "Unless, of course, you marry me within the fortnight. I have already obtained a special license. The ceremony will be private, efficient, and final." Eleanor heard the words as though from a great distance, felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the full weight of his ultimatum pressed down upon her chest, crushing the air from her lungs and the hope from her heart. She thought of her mother, already weakened by illness, dying in some squalid cell, while Eleanor lived in luxury as Vane's possession. She thought of her sister, sweet Charlotte with her dreams of music and poetry, cast into a world that devoured unprotected women without mercy or remorse, and she understood, with the terrible clarity that comes only in moments of absolute despair, that there was no escape, no rescue, no salvation that could arrive in time. That night, Eleanor stood at her window, staring down at the courtyard stones far below, and for one dark moment that would haunt her dreams for years to come, she considered the terrible freedom of falling, the brief flight, the sudden silence, the end of choices and consequences, and the endless weight of being needed by everyone and saved by no one. It was Martha who found her there, Martha who wrapped worn arms around her trembling shoulders and whispered fiercely, "He hasn't won yet, my lady. He hasn't won until you stop fighting." And Eleanor remembered Sebastian's voice in the garden, his vow to find another way, the fierce certainty in his eyes when he promised he would not let Vane claim her. She returned to her writing desk, her hands steadier now, though tears still tracked silver paths down her cheeks, and she wrote to him one final time, not a farewell, but a warning, a plea, a declaration that she would hold the line as long as her strength endured, buying him the time he needed with whatever coin her courage could provide, trusting that somehow, impossibly, love would prove stronger than the chains being forged around her. The letter arrived at Thornwood Hall as dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised violet and desperate gold, and Sebastian read Eleanor's words with hands that trembled, not from weakness but from the terrible weight of love, confronting its final test. And in that moment, standing in his study with her coded plea pressed against his chest, he understood that half measures and careful strategies would no longer serve, that only boldness, only the willingness to risk everything on a single throw of fate's dice, could hope to pull Eleanor from the closing jaws of Vane's trap. He rode through the morning mist like a man possessed, his horse's hooves drumming a rhythm of desperate purpose against roads still soft with autumn rain, and by midday he stood before the modest townhouse where Lady Ashford had taken refuge with her younger daughter, the once proud family reduced to rented rooms and borrowed time, while their eldest prepared to sacrifice herself on the altar of their survival. The butler who answered borrowed, like everything else in their diminished circumstances, initially refused him entry, for the name Blackwood carried weight enough to close doors throughout polite society. But Sebastian pressed his card into the man's hand, along with words spoken low and urgent. "Tell Lady Ashford that I come bearing proof of Lord Vane's treachery, and an offer that may save her daughter's life." The drawing-room where Lady Ashford received him was small and shabby genteel, its furnishings worn thin by years of making do, and the woman who rose to greet him bore the ravages of illness and worry in every line of her face. Yet her eyes, Eleanor's eyes, held the same fierce pride that no amount of suffering could entirely extinguish. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cool with the particular disdain reserved for men whose reputations preceded them like warning bells, "I cannot imagine what business you believe we have to discuss." Sebastian did not sit, did not soften, did not attempt the social niceties that would only insult them both. "Madam, I have loved your daughter since the summer we met 5 years ago, and I have remained silent, only because the lies spread by Lord Vane convinced me that my presence in her life would bring her nothing but harm. Those lies end today." He placed his evidence before her: documents, letters, sworn statements, and watched her face transform as she read, watched comprehension dawn like light breaking through storm clouds, watched her hand rise to cover her mouth as the full scope of Vane's villainy revealed itself. "He orchestrated everything," Sebastian continued, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Your family's ruin, my disgrace, Eleanor's entrapment. He is not her salvation, he is her destruction, and I am asking you to trust me despite everything society has told you I am." Lady Ashford looked up from the papers, tears streaming freely now, and in her gaze Sebastian saw not the condemnation he had braced himself against, but something far more precious, the desperate hope of a mother who had watched her child march toward doom and found herself powerless to intervene. "What would you have us do?" she whispered, and Sebastian felt the chains around his heart begin, at last, to loosen. "Allow me to pay your debts, all of them, immediately. Allow me to propose to Eleanor publicly, in a venue Vane cannot control, with evidence enough to destroy his credibility forever. Let me give her a choice she has never truly had." Lady Ashford's answer came not in words but in action. She rose, crossed the small room, and placed her worn hand over Sebastian's scarred one. "Save my daughter, your grace. Save her, and I will spend whatever years remain to me singing your praises to anyone who will listen." The Weatherton Ball was the event of the autumn season, its grand ballroom glittering with the combined light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, and it was into this arena of silk and scandal that Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, strode with the quiet certainty of a man who had counted the cost of his actions and found himself willing to pay any price. And Eleanor, who had been brought by Vane as a trophy to be displayed before the final claiming, felt her heart stop and restart in a new rhythm entirely when she saw him cross the threshold, his dark evening clothes impeccable, his scarred face set in lines of implacable resolve, and in his hand a leather portfolio that would, before the night was through, set fire to everything Lord Vane had built upon foundations of lies and cruelty. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the assembled guests like flame through dry kindling times. The mad Duke. Here, uninvited times, but Sebastian ignored them all, making his way through the parting crowd toward the raised dais, where the orchestra had fallen silent, and when he reached the center of the room, he turned to face the assembled aristocracy with the bearing of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out, silencing even the most determined gossips, "I come before you tonight not to beg forgiveness for my reputation, but to expose the man who manufactured it, Lord Cornelius Vane, whose crimes against the Ashford family and against common decency are documented in these papers for any who wish to examine them." He held aloft the portfolio, and Eleanor watched as color drained from Vane's face, watched as the mask of civility cracked to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "Lies," Vane spat, stepping forward, his hand moving toward his waistcoat where Eleanor knew he kept a small pistol, "the ravings of a madman desperate to steal what rightfully belongs to me." But Sebastian was not finished. "I hold here evidence of deliberate financial manipulation designed to ruin the Ashford estate, forged documents used to destroy my reputation after the death of my wife, and correspondence proving that Lord Vane's generous offer of marriage was nothing more than the final move in a decade-long campaign of theft and deception." The room erupted, voices rising in shock and outrage and morbid fascination, and through it all Sebastian's gaze found Eleanor's across the chaos, his eyes asking the question that would define both their futures. She felt Vane's hand close around her wrist, felt his fingers dig into her flesh with bruising force as he hissed, "You will come with me now, or I will destroy what little remains of your family's name." But Eleanor had spent weeks in fear, had stood at windows contemplating oblivion, had written desperate letters by candlelight while her jailer slept, and she found that she had no fear left to give him. She pulled her wrist free, feeling the skin tear beneath his grip, and walked, not ran, walked, with all the dignity of her bloodline and all the courage of her wounded heart across the ballroom floor to stand beside Sebastian Blackwood, the man society called monster and she called salvation. "I choose him," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence, and she watched as something shattered behind Vane's eyes, watched as his mask fell away entirely to reveal the twisted rage beneath. "You will regret this," he snarled, backing toward the doors as murmurs of scandal surrounded him. "Both of you will regret this until your dying breaths." And then he was gone, fled into the night like the shadow he had always been, and Eleanor felt Sebastian's hand close around hers, warm and steady and real, an anchor in the storm that was only beginning to break. The carriage that bore them away from the Weatherton ball travelled through darkness that seemed, for the first time in months, to hold promise rather than threat. And Eleanor sat beside Sebastian in silence, her torn wrist cradled in her lap, her heart beating with the strange arrhythmia of liberation as the lights of London faded behind them, and the road to Thornwood Hall stretched before them like a path into an unknown country, and Sebastian, who had not released her uninjured hand since they had fled the scandal-choked ballroom, said nothing either, understanding perhaps that words would be too small for the enormity of what had passed between them and what lay ahead. They arrived at Thornwood as dawn broke over the estate in ribbons of pearl and rose, and Eleanor, who had last seen these grounds during a stolen afternoon 5 years past, found herself weeping quietly at the sight of morning light, gilding the ancient stone walls, the overgrown gardens, the windows that seemed to blink awake at their approach like eyes opening after a long and troubled sleep. Lady Ashford and young Catherine arrived by separate carriage the following day, and Eleanor watched her mother's face as she took in the grandeur that poverty had taught them to forget. They deserved not the cold ostentation of Blackmore Hall, but something older, warmer, a house that had known both joy and sorrow and had absorbed them into its very foundations. The days that followed moved with the gentle rhythm of convalescence, of wounds tended and strength slowly returning, and Eleanor found herself discovering Thornwood as one might discover a person gradually through accumulated moments of revelation and recognition. She walked the grounds with Sebastian in the amber light of autumn afternoons, learning the names of gardens his grandmother had planted, hearing stories of the boy he had been before grief and isolation had carved severity into his features, and she began to see how the estate's neglect mirrored his own long abandonment of hope, the untended roses that still bloomed despite their wildness, the fountain whose basin had cracked but whose water still sang, the library whose books had gathered dust but whose knowledge remained, waiting. Evening conversations by firelight became the architecture of their rebuilding. Sebastian speaking haltingly at first, and then with increasing trust of his first wife, Margaret, whose illness of the mind had been a burden he had carried alone, while Vane spread whispers of cruelty and neglect, how he had held her through her terrors, how he had wept when she finally slipped away, how he had let the world believe the worst of him because defending himself had seemed pointless when the only witness to his devotion lay in the churchyard. Eleanor listened without judgment, and in return she offered her own hidden griefs, the slow death of her father, the weight of being the strong one, while her mother retreated into illness and her sister remained too young to understand the way she had learned to compress her own needs until they became invisible, even to herself. They recognized in each other the particular loneliness of those who carry others, and in that recognition, the infatuation of their youth transformed into something deeper, a love built not on summer promises but on winter truths, not on who they had hoped to become but on who they actually were. The village of Thornwood Cross lay 3 miles from the estate, a quiet hamlet of stone cottages and a single church whose bells had marked time for generations, and it was to this peaceful place that Eleanor ventured on a grey November morning to purchase ribbons for Catherine's approaching birthday. A small errand, a gesture of normalcy, a first tentative step into the world beyond the protective walls Sebastian had built around her, and she went with Martha at her side and a footman trailing at a respectful distance, believing that Vane's silence these past weeks meant acceptance of defeat, never imagining that a predator merely retreats to choose better ground. The attack came as they emerged from the milliner's shop, 3 men in rough clothing who moved with the coordinated precision of hired muscle, and Eleanor had only a moment to scream before a hand clamped over her mouth and she was being dragged toward a waiting carriage with black curtains drawn against witness, and it was then, in that crystalline instant of terror, that she saw him, Vane himself, seated within, his face a mask of vindictive triumph as he called out instructions to hurry, to silence her, to bring her before anyone could intervene. But Martha's screams had carried, and the footman had already run toward the inn where Sebastian had been concluding business with his land steward, and what happened next would live in Eleanor's memory like a painting rendered in violence and devotion. Sebastian emerging onto the street at a dead run, his coat abandoned, his face transformed into something ancient and terrible, the civilized veneer stripped away to reveal the warrior beneath, and when he reached the man who held Eleanor, he did not negotiate or threaten but simply struck once, twice, with the brutal efficiency of a man who had long ago learned that some enemies understand only force. The hired men scattered before his fury, and when Vane attempted to flee in the carriage, Sebastian dragged him from its door with one hand while the other pressed a blade to his throat, and Eleanor, released and trembling on the cobblestones, heard Sebastian's voice emerge as something between a growl and a prayer. I told you what would happen if you touched her." But he did not kill him, though Eleanor could see the desire burning in his eyes like fever, could see the effort it cost him to lower the blade as the village constable and local magistrate arrived, armed with copies of Sebastian's evidence that had been distributed weeks before against precisely this eventuality, and Lord Cornelius Vane was taken into custody, not as a peer beyond justice, but as a common criminal, his machinations finally exposed to authorities who could no longer look away. In the aftermath, as the village buzzed with shocked whispers and official statements were taken, Sebastian stood before Eleanor with blood on his knuckles and anguish in his eyes, as though he feared his violence had proven him, the monster society named him. But Eleanor reached for him with hands that still shook, pulled his face down to hers, and whispered against his lips, "You came for me. You came. You kept your promise." And when she finally wept, it was not from fear of what had almost happened, but from the overwhelming relief of being loved by someone who would tear the world apart to keep her safe. And Sebastian held her in the middle of the street, propriety abandoned, and murmured into her hair words of comfort and devotion and the raw, unpolished truth of a heart that had finally found its purpose. The weeks that followed the incident in Thornwood Cross moved with the hushed quality of a sickroom, though it was not bodies but souls that required tending, and Eleanor found herself suspended in a strange twilight between the terror of what had almost happened and the dawning recognition that she had, at last, reached safe harbor. Sebastian had withdrawn into himself after the violence, his knuckles healing while something in his eyes remained bruised, and Eleanor understood with the intuition of one who had studied him across crowded ballrooms and through years of separation that he feared she had seen the beast society named him, feared that his capacity for savagery had confirmed every whispered accusation. She found him one December afternoon in a walled garden she had not yet explored, a small sanctuary hidden behind the east wing where winter roses somehow bloomed despite the frost, and she stopped at the gate when she saw him kneeling before a simple stone marker bearing the name Margaret Blackwood and dates that spoke of a life cut cruelly short. He did not hear her approach, and she watched as he brushed snow from the carved letters with a tenderness that made her throat ache, watched as he spoke quietly to the stone words she could not hear, but whose tone carried the unmistakable cadence of apology and promise, and the particular grief of those who loved someone they could not save. When he finally sensed her presence and turned, his face held such naked vulnerability that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks unbidden, and she went to him without hesitation, kneeling in the snow beside him, taking his cold hands in hers. "Tell me about her," she said, and he did, haltingly at first. Then, with increasing freedom, the story of a gentle woman whose mind had betrayed her, whose terrors he had fought alongside until there were no more battles left to wage, whose death had released her from suffering while condemning him to Vane's lies and society's judgment. "I was not a perfect husband," Sebastian confessed, his voice rough with old grief. "I grew weary. I lost patience. I sometimes wished for escape from the endless vigil, and those wishes haunt me still. Eleanor, they prove that darkness lives within me, the very darkness they all believe." But Eleanor pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him, and spoke the truth that had been growing in her heart through all their firelit conversations and autumn walks. "You stayed. When you could have abandoned her to asylums and physicians, you stayed and held her through the terror and loved her until the end. That is not darkness. Sebastian, that is a light so fierce it blinds those too small to comprehend it." And then, because honesty demanded reciprocity, she offered her own hidden shame, The resentment she had harbored toward her father for dying and leaving them destitute, toward her mother for retreating into illness, toward Catherine for being young enough to be spared the worst of their poverty, the ugly, human feelings she had buried beneath duty, until they had calcified into a belief that she was somehow unworthy of happiness, that her survival had cost her the right to joy. They remained in Margaret's garden as the winter light faded, two wounded souls finally laying down the armor they had worn so long it had become indistinguishable from skin. And when Sebastian drew her into his arms, it was not with the desperate passion of their youth, but with the profound recognition of kindred spirits who had walked through their separate fires and emerged scarred but still capable of warmth. And Eleanor understood at last that his heart was vast enough to honor the past while embracing the present, that loving Margaret's memory did not diminish his love for her, but rather proved its depth, and she whispered against his chest that she was not afraid of his darkness, because she had her own, and perhaps together they could make of their shadows something that resembled light. The chapel at Thornwood Hall had stood for 3 centuries, its ancient stones having witnessed generations of Blackwood unions, and yet none of those ceremonies could have carried the weight of meaning that pressed upon its walls on the morning Eleanor Ashford became the Duchess of Ashworth, for this was not merely a wedding but a resurrection, a defiance, a declaration that love could survive the machinations of cruel men and the whispered condemnations of an unforgiving world. Snow had fallen through the night, blanketing the estate in pristine white that seemed to Eleanor like absolution, like the world itself had chosen to begin anew alongside them, and she stood before the small mirror in her chamber as Martha fastened the final buttons of a gown that was neither the elaborate confection society expected nor the borrowed finery she had worn at Vane's ball, but something simpler and truer ivory silk that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, altered with careful hands and offered with tears by Lady Ashford, who had found in her future son-in-law not the monster of reputation, but the devoted guardian her daughter deserved. The chapel glowed with the light of 100 candles when Eleanor entered on her mother's arm, for her father was gone, and tradition must bend to truth, and she saw first the ancient stained glass depicting saints who had suffered for their devotion, then the small gathering of those who had stood by them, Martha weeping already, Catherine radiant in her role as witness, the servants who had come to love their stern master's intended bride, and the vicar whose initial reluctance had transformed into genuine warmth upon hearing their story. But all of this faded to mere periphery when her eyes found Sebastian waiting at the altar, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the transformation written across his features. The harsh lines softened, the guarded darkness lifted, the man who had believed himself unworthy of love, standing straight and certain in his conviction that she had proven him wrong. His eyes glistened as she approached, and when she placed her hand in his, she felt the tremor that ran through him, not fear, but the overwhelming force of hope finally permitted expression. The vows they spoke were the traditional words, yet they emerged weighted with private meaning. To have and to hold became a promise never to release what had been so hard won. For better or worse, acknowledged the worst they had already survived, until death do us part, carried the fierce certainty that not even death would truly divide what had been forged in such fire. When Sebastian slipped the ring upon her finger, a simple gold band that had also belonged to his mother, for he wanted no ghost of his first marriage. To shadow this new beginning, Eleanor felt the last of her carefully maintained composure crumble, and tears slipped freely down her cheeks as he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with reverence that bordered on worship. That evening, after the modest wedding breakfast and the warm embraces of family, after the snow had ceased and the clouds had parted to reveal a sky brilliant with winter stars, Sebastian led Eleanor to the master chambers that had been prepared with fresh flowers despite the season, with fires burning warm against the December chill, with every comfort arranged by servants who had watched their master emerge from years of frozen grief into something that resembled joy. They stood together at the window where Sebastian had once watched storms alone, and Eleanor leaned into his strength as his arms encircled her, and he spoke against her hair in a voice rough with emotion. "You have saved me from myself. Eleanor, you have given me reason to be the man I always hoped I might become, rather than the monster I feared I was." And she turned in his embrace to cup his face in her hands and answer with the truth that had taken root in her heart through all their trials. "We have saved each other. Sebastian, we have proven that the world does not always win, that darkness does not always prevail, that two broken souls can somehow make each other whole. And when he kissed her, the candles flickered, as though blessed by witnessed joy, and beyond the window the stars blazed their ancient light upon a union that had defied every obstacle placed before it, and the night deepened around them, soft as a benediction, gentle as the peace they had finally earned. 5 years had passed since that winter wedding, 5 years in which Thornwood Hall had undergone a transformation so complete that visitors who had known its former gloom could scarcely reconcile memory with reality, for where once neglected gardens had sprawled in wild abandon, now roses climbed trellises in disciplined profusion and lavender-bordered paths, where children's laughter echoed against ancient stone, and where once silence had pressed upon every room like a physical weight, now music drifted from open windows, and the clatter of small feet upon staircases announced the presence of life renewed and multiplied. Eleanor stood on the terrace on a June afternoon, her daughter Charlotte balanced upon her hip with the comfortable ease of practiced motherhood, watching as Sebastian led their son James across the paddock on a gentle grey pony, the boy's face alight with the particular joy of childhood adventure, while his father walked alongside with a patience that would have astonished those who remembered only the fearsome Duke of reputation and rumour. The years had been kind to Sebastian in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time, and everything to do with the healing power of love, freely given and gratefully received. The harsh lines that had once carved his features into a mask of forbidding severity had softened into something approaching warmth, and though he would never be called gregarious, those who knew him now spoke of quiet kindness, of unexpected generosity, of a man who had emerged from self-imposed exile to serve in Parliament with distinction and to champion causes that protected the vulnerable from the predations of the powerful. His reputation had been fully restored, the evidence against Vane having proved so damning that society had been forced to reconsider its judgment, and though some whispered that the Tun's rehabilitation of the Duke of Ashworth owed as much to his wealth and influence as to proof of his innocence, Eleanor knew that Sebastian cared nothing for society's good opinion. He cared only that his children would never hear their father called monster, that his wife would never again lower her eyes in company, that the Blackwood name would pass to the next generation unstained by lies. Of Vane, little needed to be said. His crimes had seen him stripped of title and lands, exiled to the continent, where he had died 3 years past in circumstances that spoke of dissolution and despair, a fitting end for a man who had built his life upon the destruction of others. Lady Ashford lived now in the dower house at Thornwood, her health restored by comfort and peace, while Catherine had made a brilliant match with a viscount who adored her, and Martha had become head housekeeper, ruling the staff with benevolent efficiency. As Sebastian lifted James from the pony, and the boy ran toward his mother with tales of bravery and speed, Eleanor felt her husband's gaze find hers across the distance, and in that look passed everything words could not carry. Gratitude, wonder, the fierce protective love that had once growled, "Touch her and die," transformed now into the quieter devotion of partnership and peace. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a summer storm, approaching from beyond the hills, but Eleanor did not flinch, for she had learned that storms passed, that darkness broke into dawn, that the most violent tempests often cleared the air for the brightest mornings, and she raised her hand to wave at Sebastian as he strode toward her. Their family gathered upon the terrace that had once witnessed only solitary vigil, and the thunder became not threat but promise of rain, to nourish the gardens that bloomed around them, in testament to all that patient love could grow from devastated ground. Dear listener, as we leave Eleanor and Sebastian to their hard-won happiness, as the thunder fades into the distance and the children's laughter echoes across the blooming gardens of Thornwood Hall, permit me a moment to speak directly to your heart about what this story has truly meant. For beneath the romance and the intrigue, beneath the growled threats and the desperate escapes, lies a truth that perhaps you needed to hear tonight. That love, real love, the kind that transforms and redeems and endures, is patient enough to survive even destruction, brave enough to wait through years of exile and misunderstanding, fierce enough to stand against enemies who seem insurmountable, and declare with unwavering certainty that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Perhaps you find yourself tonight in your own impossible arrangement, trapped by circumstances not of your making, bound by duty or debt or the expectations of others who cannot see the truth of your heart. And perhaps you have wondered whether escape is possible, whether hope is foolish, whether the one who might save you exists only in stories told to comfort the desperate. I would remind you that Sebastian Blackwood was called Monster by the world that feared what it did not understand, that his fierce protectiveness was mistaken for cruelty, that his devotion was twisted into scandal by those who profited from his isolation, and yet beneath that fearsome exterior beat a heart capable of the tenderest love, a soul that had merely been waiting for someone brave enough to see past the rumors to the truth. The fiercest protections, you see, rise from the tenderest hearts. Those who have known pain become the most determined to shield others from it. Those who have been betrayed become the most loyal once their trust is earned. Those whom the world calls dark are often merely those who have learned to guard their light from those who would extinguish it. And perhaps you yourself have been the one called Monster, the one misunderstood and maligned, the one who withdrew into isolation rather than continue fighting for acceptance from those who would never grant it. And perhaps you have believed the lies told about you, have accepted the loneliness as your deserved lot, have forgotten that you too are worthy of the love that Eleanor brought to Sebastian's abandoned halls. To you, I say, redemption awaits those who dare to hope. Transformation belongs to those who risk vulnerability despite every wound that taught them to guard themselves. And the right person, the one who will see you truly, love you wholly, stand beside you unwaveringly, may be closer than you imagine, may be watching even now for some sign that you have not surrendered entirely to despair. Let this story be that sign. Let these words be permission to believe again, to reach toward connection even when fear counsels retreat, to trust that storms, however violent, however long they rage, do eventually break into morning, and that the dawn that follows the darkest night is the most beautiful of all. May you find your Eleanor, your Sebastian, your love that defies every obstacle. May you discover that the heart you thought too broken still remembers how to hope, and may you sleep tonight, wrapped in the knowledge that your story is not yet finished, that the next chapter may hold wonders you cannot yet imagine, and that somewhere, somehow, spring is already preparing to bloom in the most devastated gardens of your soul. Rest now, dear listener, rest in peace and courage and the quiet faith that the best is yet to come.